Hello and welcome. My name's Thomas Barlow. I'm here from Real Media discussing the future of the BBC with co-founder of Novara Media, host of Novara FM and host of I'm Bastani. It's Aaron Bastani. Thank you very much for joining us here today.
Thank you for having me, Thomas.
Brilliant. It's brilliant to have you. Now, you've been writing a bit on the future of the BBC, what we could do with the BBC, especially for the 100 ideas of the BBC. 2016 sees the renewal of the charter, the BBC charter, and usually this happens every 10 years without very much discussion or debates, not at least at a public level, but this year is set to be a bit different. Can you explain to us why that is and what your thoughts are on that?
Well, you've got the renewal of the charter, as you've already touched upon. You've obviously also got a Conservative government. We had a coalition from 2010 to 2015. We've now got just a purely Conservative government. We've got a new guy at the DCMS, John Whittingdale. Seems almost like there's a perfect storm now, majority Conservative government, charter renewal and Whittingdale, that I think, yeah, it's quite probable you'll see big changes, big challenges for the BBC this year, next year. Could be terminal challenges.
Terminal challenges, yeah, and that's a very interesting thing because, yeah, as you mentioned, John Whittingdale has been announced as the Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport, and as such he's in charge of the charter renewal. Now, some have described this as a war on the BBC, but the editor of Open Democracy, David Elstein, said it's a wise move by David Cameron, and in fact he's not an enemy of the BBC. What's your opinion on that? Is that fair?
David Elstein's a much wiser man on these affairs than I am. He's got a lot more experience. I mean, literally he's been involved in these organisations, as a professional. He's defending Whittingdale, I think, because Whittingdale's taken an interest in media issues for much of his parliamentary career. He was on the relevant parliamentary committee. He was heading it, in fact. And so I think from a technocratic standpoint, his view, and I think that's correct, is that Whittingdale knows more about the ins and outs of media reform, the BBC, than his predecessors, right? People like Andy Burnham or James Purnell. And you've got to remember the DCMS is the smallest government department. And let's work on the presumption that politicians are egotistical, narcissistic, power-hungry, money-grabbing, status-loving. Let's work on that presumption. They don't want to stay long at the smallest government department, do they? So they've always seen, historically, people like Purnell in particular, who's out at the BBC, talk about a revolving door. They've always seen that DCMS role, ditto, by the way, with Whittingdale's predecessor, Sadiq Javid, I don't know, this guy. Anyway, son of a bus driver, apparently. Done very well for himself, multi-millionaire. Like Purnell, like Burnham, he saw the role as a stepping stone to something bigger, right? Because it's a very small department, not much power, not much status. I think Elstein's right to a point, and that point is Whittingdale isn't seeing this as a means to something bigger and better. He actually takes interest in media reform. Secondary point, though, is what kind of media reform, right? What are his politics? Where's he coming from? This guy was a private secretary to Thatcher. He was a really crucial player in some of the Thatcher parts of the Thatcher regime, particularly in the mid-80s to the late 80s, I believe. So yes and no. Yes and no is what he certainly won't. He certainly won't bring any ignorance to the role or apathy to the issues at hand. Whittingdale will certainly care about those. The problem is for progressives that he probably has a politics, I would say, diametrically opposed to ours.
Yeah, and that's, because that's an interesting point, because as you mentioned, it's going to be this year the 30th anniversary of the Wapping dispute. Whittingdale was a close aide, was Thatcher's personal aide during that time, and has since that time become a very close friend of Rupert Murdoch. Now, before the election, David Cameron said, I'm going to end the BBC. And also the Independent reported, front page news, that, that Rupert Murdoch went in across from the Independent in the same building, berating his editors for not finishing Miliband enough. It's still too close, you've got to finish Miliband. Is the appointment of Whittingdale a quid pro quo? I mean, is this a way of the Conservatives, purposely trying to end the BBC? Is this part of political agenda? Is this, are these coincidental sort of discussions that have been had, or do you think this is something they planned? Because he was appointed within 3 days of the new government taking power. So do you think that they specifically thought, well, okay, Rupert's helped us out in a pinch, he's helped us get an election, and it was shown that actually in the last week, Murdoch's media helped change the agenda, so the NHS wasn't even in the top 5 subjects discussed, whereas it was the top 1 or 2 all of the weeks previous to that. Do you think that these things are connected, or that just Whittingdale's just put the time in, and that they,
There's not much talent in the cabinet, is there? I mean, who else would you put there? It would either be some sort of some jumped up, somebody from the 2010 intake, or somebody like Javid, or I don't know, right? One of these people. Take Justine Greening. She was at Transport previously. I mean, they're just so talentless. I mean, they're talentless actually just as people, right? They're talentless as people, but then the lack of historical application they tend to bring to these roles, health, transport, culture, media, and sport, is unbelievable. So I think in that sense, Whittingdale makes sense as a choice, in that he brings some experience, some intelligence, some intellect to the role. He knows what he's doing. Was it a quid pro quo? Who knows? I mean, the whole cabinet could be a quid pro quo with various people. I'd work on the presumption that changing the BBC for good is pretty high on the list of priorities for this government between now and 2020.
Yeah. Well, then coming to that, these changes, some of the ones proposed from the committee that Whittingdale headed up, and then the Green Paper that followed, include things like privatisation of Channel 4, which a lot of people don't realise that Channel 4 is 50% funded by the licence fee. The sort of decriminalisation of paying the licence fee, which would drastically reduce, further top slicing, basically.
A couple of $100 million, right?
Yeah, a couple of $100 million, and we're losing a couple of $100 million from giving, licences free to the over 75s, from taking on the World Service, from providing other services like the digital rollout and stuff like that. So, the BBC is going to be severely squeezed. In fact, today, James Harding announced that BBC News 24 may have to go, just go completely.
It's not much for a loss, is it?
Yeah, well, I mean, that's what many progressives are going to say. Many Conservatives would say that the BBC has an inherent liberal bias,
right,
and many progressives are going to say that that it's got an inherent right-wing bias.
Let's take a bit on politics for a second with BBC News 24. I think News 24 was an attempt by the BBC to basically replicate the kind of Ted Turner stuff that was coming out of the United States at the end of the 1980s. That was pre-social media, actually, right? So you've set up BBC News 24, 24-hour news cycle, and all of a sudden you've got a new raft of technologies after 2006, YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, and they've changed the rules of the game. And all of a sudden, actually, when you look at 24-hour news, we don't have a 24-hour news cycle anymore. I wouldn't dare to say what the ontology of it is. It's something quite different, I think, to what it was before. It just looks very staid as a form, BBC News 24, actually. And it's not really as dynamic, as interesting and as alert as Twitter, right? If you want to go to a breaking news story, you don't go to BBC News 24, you go to Twitter. And obviously these things are being updated in real time, and BBC News 24 will play the same story every 15 minutes for 6 hours, and then it'll adapt. Whereas, you're seeing real-time adaptations on live blogs. The Guardian does great live blogs. The BBC does good live blogs. I think actually as a resource for the viewer, the consumer of the news, those live blogs are much more useful than something like BBC News 24. I mean, who watches BBC News 24 anyway? People like us, right? I mean, I used to love BBC News 24 because I was just a news junkie. But then Twitter comes about, and you just think, well, who cares, right? Who wants to watch this? This is infinitely, this is just but a bland shadow of what this is. So I would say let's scrap News 24 as well, and that's not really a political problem. It's nothing. The BBC News operation in general is a nothing, but News 24, I think, exhibits the very worst features and flaws of it.
Well, yeah, and that does pose an interesting question, because maybe everyone cares about the BBC in different ways, whether it's Doctor Who or Strictly Come Dancing. Not many people seem to love its news output. As I say, widely derided from the left and the right. The BBC is derided a lot more from the right culturally, and it's seen as a vehicle of social liberalism. There's no right-wing comedians, there's a far broader range of ethnic minorities and people of different backgrounds than maybe they would like. I'm not entirely sure, why. But again, why, when these big changes are happening, why should people care about the BBC? In this day and age.
I think that right-wing interpretation of the BBC is correct to a point, right? So I think the BBC probably is socially liberal, right? But it also seems to advance I'd say a variant of economic liberalism, somewhere between one nation tourism and outright Thatcherism, right? It really doesn't cover the whole terrain of political debate. It doesn't have, for instance, committed industrial dispute reporting like it used to, right? That doesn't happen anymore. You look at people who are covering the business portfolios and the economics portfolios, Evan Davis, Robert Peston. Okay, his dad's a Labour peer, but he's a Labour peer. These are not normal people. You look at the people covering a lot of the political coverage. Allegra Stratton, she's married to James Forsyth, works at The Spectator. We don't need to talk about their political views. Laura Kuenssberg, I think her uncle or a relative not long ago was, very high up in the colonial kind of administration of Nigeria prior to its independence. Allegra Stratton, I think, went to one of the top schools, St. Paul's, I think. She went to St. Paul's School. And now these aren't personal criticisms. They may be very nice people. Jeremy Corbyn is essentially, people are career politicians. Jeremy Corbyn's essentially a career politician, right? But the point is, these senior political and economics editors throughout the BBC, particularly, let's say, Newsnight, where Laura Kuenssberg is, and then the news operations proper, I think broadly define much of their output. And they also seem to shape a lot of how that output then reflects onto social media, right? Because Nick Robinson has something like 300,000 followers, right? Ditto Kuenssberg, ditto Peston. So let's say they reflect a certain economic kind of orthodoxy, right? I would say the BBC, we never really had a proper liberal party in this country, right? The sort of tragedy of the Labour Party in the 20th century was over time it increasingly became that urban-based liberal party that other countries have. It didn't remain a party of the trade union radical left. It didn't do that because that space was vacated by the Liberal Party, right? We didn't have a political system which could accept three parties, really. It was always going to have to be two parties, with the exception, of course, of nationalist influences, right? Sinn Féin in the 1918 election, SNP more recently. It was always going to be a two-party system, which meant that Labour moved into that space of effectively being an urban-based liberal party. We've never had that in this country, right? But we do have some institutions that reflect that orthodoxy of social liberalism, economic liberalism. I'd say the BBC stands out for me, right? Yeah. And we've got some big thinkers, J.M. Keynes. Keynes was a proper liberal. He was a social liberal, he was an economic liberal, right? That changed over time, but I think that's a pretty fair assessment of him. Ditto Beveridge. But they never had a political party, these guys, right? Well, certainly not after the 1920s. So I think the BBC is an expression of a certain kind of British liberalism, and I think that explains critiques from both the left and the right. Mm-hmm. I think in terms of how it holds the government of the day to account right now since 2010, I think the bias is indisputable, quite frankly. Yeah. But that's just one opinion.
Yeah. And it's certainly borne out by certain studies. Certainly studies done by Cardiff and Loughborough have shown that, it has an economic bias towards, neoliberalism, towards big business, towards the City of London. And as, right wingers would point out, it isn't actually pro-Europe, it's very pro-Eurosceptic. Also, during the lead up to the Iraq War, for instance, it was, it did around about 78% of its output was pro-war, as determined by, again, the University of Loughborough. So it's seen as quite a nationalist and...
Just a regime broadcaster, right?
Yeah. Right.
I don't mean that in a polemical, provocative sense. I mean, it is literally a regime broadcaster. Yeah. The functions, look at, for instance, the relationship between the World Service and the Foreign and Commonwealth Office. Yeah. I mean, it's in broad, it's in day, clear as day, right?
Yeah. Yeah, RT or AJ Plus maybe, attacked for the same thing. But then why should progressives care about the changes at BBC, and what can we hope to do? I mean, why would we get involved, and what are we looking to try and achieve?
Well, I'm not, speaking from a personal position, I'm not like Varoufakis with the EU. I'm not saying we have to say this, otherwise, the world's going to the proverbial. I would say the BBC, look, the left is very hesitant to talk about what Britain has and what it can do and what change in this country would mean for the world more broadly. Clearly, if we had a radical government in this country, if we had a radical movement for change in this country at the constitutional level, but also at the level of, sort of the global governance architecture, right? So we said, look, we want to change. We have a government that wants to change the Competition Security Council, wants to change how the IMF works, the World Bank, the WTO. Britain's one of a very select few group of countries that could do this. Yeah. I'm not saying it's probable, I'm saying it's possible. Yeah. Not many other countries can do that. 6th biggest economy in the world, I think by defence spending, 6th biggest in the world. We punch above our weight diplomatically, right? As I've already said, we're on the Security Council. a radical left government, a radical progressive movement in this country could have ramifications globally. How does that stitch into the BBC? The BBC is one of I would say, a range of institutions. I'd include the City of London, the British Army, the BBC, the NHS. And these are institutions which, if they could be recalibrated, remade, reorganised, I think their affordances could all of a sudden be repurposed for very radical ends, right? NHS, I think maybe third, fourth biggest employer in the world, over 1 million people. British Army spends $60 billion worth of taxpayers' money every year. If we were to repurpose that engineering base, if we were to take the engineers currently for BAE Systems and building RAF Tornadoes and all this nonsense, say, look, we want to have zero emission economy by 2060, they could do it. If we were saying to, smarter people in the city, we want, different kinds of financial institutions which understand risk in new ways. If we said to the NHS, we don't want you to pay below £10 for anybody in that organisation, we want, investment in research in the most important technology of the 21st century, synthetic genomics, all this kind of stuff, that would be amazing. And the same with the BBC. I don't see why this institution couldn't become a real avenue for change. So what could we do about it? There are loads of things we could do about it. We could do some things next week. We could have so at 100 Ideas, the BBC, we had some, obviously some great pieces on precisely that question. We were having people saying, well, let's have a committed women's editor, right? So they can bring together issues of austerity and international development, you name it, the renewable agenda, work, race issues, bring them under the umbrella of gender. Ditto, you could have obviously committed editors around a number of these issues. I'd say gender would be good, I'd say race would be good, and we should definitely obviously have committed industrial journalists again. They're things we could do next week for a better BBC. My personal proposal was we need to maybe get a third of the BBC News budget, commit this to a different kind of news reporting. So maybe this would be a bit like, Arts Council funding at the moment, and it would be given to incipient media actors, right, like you guys, or like Novara Media, or like Open Democracy, or whatever. And this money would be, this is the top of my head, right? But this money would be allocated every 2 years, let's say. And you'd have to have certain returns on it. These wouldn't be financial returns, it'd be certain returns. We've done X, Y, and Z with this money. And they'd be accountable to a board of trustees, directors, who may be democratically elected. There'd be some specialists. I think it'd be a good way to do it. So that would be a third of BBC News' money going over to this. Alongside that, you'd have a placement system where you'd have reporters, camera people, producers, editors, videographers, everybody would have to spend a certain amount of time with these organisations, right? And then they'd be taking ideas and skills back into the BBC. So it's not just going one way. They're taking know-how into these new organisations, but then they'll be taking new practices that, this incumbent hasn't even thought about yet. So I think there's a real possibility there for a dynamic interplay between the financial sort of might of the BBC and its cognitive sort of capacities, and how that could embolden, empower, strengthen civil society, and how a lot of this kind of incipient energy, these new ideas, could make the BBC more relevant again in news reporting.
Excellent, yeah, and that's actually quite a key distinction in what you were suggesting is in news reporting. But do you think one of the concerns for the BBC is that its funding is supposedly independent of government, but it really isn't, and it has become more and more of a political football as time has gone on. I mean, do you think there's a way of democratising the BBC or creating more independence, and that would be a fundamental stepping stone or fundamental basis, a foundation for further progressive change? Because at the moment it seems like we are reliant totally on sort of trying to change the BBC through the nation state and through an incumbent government that would not be interested in progressive ideas. Yeah. Unless, obviously, we look at, say, the NUJ Love It or Lose It campaign, and that's about the only sort of... there's Open Democracy and there's the NUJ. There seems to be only two serious institutional actors that are trying to come at it.
Great campaign, the NUJ campaign.
Yeah,
very good.
And it's important, and I think, people should realise that it's a lot easier to become a member of the NUJ in the new media age, you know, and they're changing the rules, you know, around this, and they're embracing new media. And I think it's important for anyone out there who's involved in new media to get involved. But do you think that's enough?
That's good advice. Yeah.
Yeah. Right. So yeah. Do you think that's enough? And do you think this can be a single issue campaign, or does it have to be rooted in a social movement?
Well, I mean, the thing about the BBC being increasingly politicised, let's work on the counterfactual is it isn't increasingly politicised. Maybe it's always been this politicised. I interviewed Peter Oborne, former political editor at the Telegraph. Now he writes at the Mail. He writes at a range of outlets, doesn't he? And I mean, that was his point. He said it's always been politicised, right? We've always had MI5, MI6 people inside the BBC. This is a matter of record. I'm not just sort of. This is, you know, there are people. I have my suspicions about various people in the BBC who probably continue that, you know, that noble tradition of you know, secret services having people working in top media positions. So I think it's always been politicised to an extent. I just think that's a little bit more brazen, you know, arguably since the early 1980s. But I mean, I think Oborne was right about this in the interview I did with him, and that's available at the Open Democracy YouTube channel. You know, there was clearly a level of politicisation going on, for instance, under Thatcher in the mid-80s, you know, very akin to what's going on right now. So it's not that new. In terms of what we could change, I think I'm just astounded that the directors aren't already democratically accountable. Either they're subject to, you know, we can vote for these police, what are they even called? Like 10% of the police committee, and I don't know what they're called, right? You can vote for these people. There was no engagement with that. Nobody thought they wanted to do it. Yet, you know, the BBC is a very loved institution. Yeah, look, we haven't got tens of millions of people saying we can't have the BBC go, but I think it's a really salient issue to at least a good couple of million people, right? Who would probably participate in that kind of process if it was there. That's certainly more than what we're having for these police commissioners, or even MEPs. You know, the sort of democratic mandate behind most MEPs is pretty weak, actually. So, yeah, we should have them elected. And if you want a few sort of technocratic positions, I mean, I'm not really in favour of that, but okay. I think the current situation is completely unacceptable. It's completely unacceptable. And it, you know, it really embodies that central feature of when you want change in Britain after 45, you have to sort of grab the levers of the state. You know, that's been the Labour left position for a long time, right? You have to grab the levers of the state and then change these things through having power at Westminster. I don't think that's good enough anymore. You know, we've got to have a better way of holding the BBC to account, you know, having it create the kind of programming we want that's not dependent on whoever's at Westminster. I just think that's completely, you know, unhinged in the 21st century, frankly.
Yeah, so you know, when talking about that, it's interesting. I've heard you mention Gramsci, and you know, how relevant do you think his thinking is to the way we should be approaching changing the BBC?
Well, Gramsci, for people that don't know, haven't heard about this guy, he was a Communist Party member, the Italian Communist Party, the PCI. He was an intellectual operating 1910s, 1920s, died in prison. He wrote a lot about this stuff in the 1920s. And his input basically into the intellectual life of 20th century communism was that, well, the 1917 revolution in Russia never transpired in the rest of the continent, right? Spartan uprising doesn't work out in Germany. Italian worker occupations in the 20s don't really work out. We get the rise of fascism instead. What's happened? And he said, well, look, obviously Bolshevism's not working. There's a problem here. So clearly, in terms of affecting political change, it can't just be about grabbing, you know, the administrative arms of the state, the army, the civil service, the foreign. It can't just be that if we want to change things. Clearly, we also have to capture the cultural institutions which legitimise this kind of veneer. I mean, this is in Marx as well. Marx is about base and superstructure, right? The superstructure is the ideological superstructure that builds on the base. And if we're looking at Britain in the 21st century, what are the kinds of institutions which reproduce consent, right? And this is Gramsci's big input. He says, power doesn't just reproduce itself through coercion, but also through consent, through a mix of the two. He builds on a few ideas from Machiavelli there. So it's consent and coercion, it's the fox and it's the minotaur, it's the fox and the something else, right? He builds on Machiavelli, yeah. So he said it's Consent and coercion. So if we're talking about Britain in the 21st century, what kinds of institutions reproduce consent? Well, clearly a lot of the print media, right? I mean, they won the last general election. You've already talked about The Sun. Did they win it this time around? Maybe not. They definitely won it in '92 for the Conservative Party. They're clearly a very big player. They're big. The print media is very big. But actually, I think if you're talking about the BBC, I think it's unprecedented, right? The BBC has something like, I think it's something like 70% of all online news read in this country. I think it's 75% of all radio news, 70% of all television news watched. Not broadcast, watched, right? In terms of the audience figures. So in terms of the manufacture of consent, the reproduction of consent, BBC is unprecedented. So if you're talking about Gramsci, if you're saying that power reproduces itself through consent as much as coercion, you can't not talk about the BBC because it's got 70% of the TV news audience, right? You can't say, well, we're going to affect change by, you know, having our own newspaper here, or there'll be Novara Media, or there'll be Real Media. This is great. This is fantastic, right? But here's another binary. You've got Fabian strategies and you've got Gramscian strategies. Fabian strategies say, like the Fabians, we'll get existing institutions and we'll change them, right? And Gramscian strategies say, well, we'll create new institutions and we'll circumvent them, right? And they'll have to adapt to us. And I think maybe, you know, we have to do a bit of both. We need both Fabian strategies and Gramscian strategies. Fabian strategy includes transforming the BBC. I don't think that should be done at the cost of creating new media actors, however, right? So I think you have to do both. To just focus on one I think is narrow-minded, it means you're probably going to fail. So yes, that's where Gramsci comes in. It's about reorienting the BBC from both within and beyond. And yeah, it's fundamentally accepting, recognising that you can't change anything without changing the culture of a society. How do you change the culture of society? You change the culture of institutions. The BBC, for my money, is, you know, nobody touches it in this country as a cultural institution.
And yeah, I think that I couldn't agree more. And you know, obviously we're about creating alternatives, but our two key mission statements are, you know, to create and promote alternative and public interest journalism and alternative media, but also to oppose mass media distortion and to change it where we can, campaign against that. And I think that's something that, you know, we have to be more active about. It can't be one or t'other. We've seen that we don't have the...
Well, this is my proposal as well, right? I'm saying with the BBC News budget, let's take a third of that into precisely these kinds of organisations. Because, yeah, I think we totally agree on this. We're not going to say the BBC, we're going to change the BBC and everything will be fine, right? But also we have to accept that our endeavours can't be seen in isolation from the BBC and where the BBC goes in 20 years. Because we're not going to get rid of it, you know?
Yeah, well, I did a piece for Novara Wire about why lefties should get involved with changing the BBC. I did one for Open Democracy about why Conservatives should get involved with protecting the BBC. But there was a lot of kickback, especially, you know, a lot of good friends of ours like Media Lens and so forth have spent, you know, well over a decade exposing how the BBC manufactures consent, has you know, manufactured the support or legitimised, especially the occupation invasion of Iraq. But in fact, prior to that, you know, the sanctions on Iraq that killed 500,000 children and the resignations that followed from, you know, key UN officials like Halliday and von Spock, these were not covered by BBC or The Guardian or any of the liberal media at all. And it's continuously, you know, again, we see recently with Syria, it's not just the attacks on, say, liberal politicians and the exclusion of any sort of progressive thinkers or progressive actors. I mean, they covered the recent demonstration in Manchester, but only to let you know that, like, a journalist had been spat on.
Well, it was Michael Crick.
Yeah, so, Michael Crick, and it was kind of understandable. I mean, you know, from what we heard from the Conservatives, the guys who got egged were actually, you know, and there was a small report on this, that they were like doing a trial to become, you know, fully fledged members of the Young Conservatives, and they had to go out there with pictures of Thatcher and rile up the crowd, and they got a couple of eggs. And this is what was reported, despite the GMP, who are a pretty vile police force, saying this is the most well-behaved demonstration they've ever, and it's the largest in Manchester history. Well, the one before that, the BBC didn't even cover. They didn't even put it on the red ticker tape at the bottom during the Tory Party conference, and that was in Manchester as well. You know, obviously very opposed to the Tories and had something like 70, 80,000 at that one. And they've consistently ignored, derided, or sidelined alternative voices, progressive voices. They have pushed a nationalist agenda that has allowed genocide and murder on a scale unimaginable in the 21st century. how can we square that circle? You know, I mean, how can we say to people, but no, we should get involved in changing this, you know, because then we end up sounding a lot like Labour reformists have done for a long time, Labour Party reformists, and maybe that's shown some fruit, but maybe it's also, you know, there's still, at the end of the day, you're still taking over a corrupt institution.
Absolutely. I don't think the BBC anytime soon, in terms of its news reporting, is going to be radical or, you know, real importance to people who, you know, care about changing the world for the better. I don't think that's going to happen anytime soon. But, you know, we are where we are. We make history, but not under conditions of our own making, as a very wise person once put it. And the conditions we sort of face in Britain are, there is this media actor that has 70% of the TV news market, 75% of the radio news market. You can't just ignore that. You know, America has seen, if you look at America, I think 2004, George W. gets re-elected, right? This looks like the kind of nadir of the American progressive sort of left, you know? It looks terrible. And they, you know, it looks like Reagan's moral majority won't stop marching on. These people aren't getting older, they're not dying. You know, when's it going to end? And then let's fast forward to 2015. Now, I'm not, you know, I'm not an uncritical supporter of Barack Obama by any means, and both the houses are still under Republican control. But if you look at social attitudes in America on LGBTQ rights, on issues of race, on same-sex marriage, right? What's happening over there? Decriminalisation of certain narcotics in Oklahoma. I mean, cannabis is legal now, right? So you've got a president, I'd say probably the most liberal president since Carter, maybe even more than Carter, being outflanked by movements to his left, right? Which is the most important thing, by the way. And compare that to 2004, everything's changed. That can't be seen in isolation from a huge sort of flurry of new sort of media or voices. The Daily Kos was really significant for the Democratic Party. Now you're seeing just a range of them, right? Amazing stuff in The Nation, The Atlantic, you know, the kinds of... You don't get this in the UK. You just simply don't get this kind of content in the UK. There are some people, bigger actors, the LRB, for instance, which incidentally, it's really done incredibly well.
Should we just make that clear? That's the London Review of Books, which did an excellent piece on Hobsbawm and MI5 in the BBC, actually, which everyone should read.
We've got some great institutions doing that, but not that many. Why is that? It's because the BBC has such a large part of the news market. So yeah, we need more LRBs, more Navaras, more real medias, but we also have to accept the BBC is what it is and we have to work with it. At the very least, that has to necessitate incremental changes like I already outlined. A committed women's editor, right? Committed LGBTQ editor, committed, you know, editor around, you know, race relations is not the right word. You need people whose portfolios is to deal with these huge issues, bring in things that seem completely, you know, separated from one another, bring them under one umbrella. So how does austerity relate to issues of gender and race, right? That could happen, like I said, tomorrow. At the very least, we should be aiming for that, right? We can't ignore it. We can't afford to ignore it. We can have pure hands, but that will lead to a far worse politics, I think.
Excellent. Well, I think on that note, that perfectly covers it. Unless you've got any further thoughts to share with us on what you'd like to see for the BBC, we shall let you go. And
what I'd like to see the BBC. I would like in 10 years' time, I'm really confident we'll have a committee for truth and reconciliation in this country. And I think Laura Kuenssberg, Michael Crick and Evan Davis will be standing trial. If there is a higher being, then I'm fully confident that will transpire, yeah.
Well, that's...
But we are, if there is a higher being, we're also the instruments of that higher being, so we've got to do what we've got to do, right?
Yeah.
Which is bring these people to justice.
Absolutely. Well, that would be... That would be...
Fellow NUJ members.
Fellow NUJ members, make that your call to arms and getting T-shirts printed up now for the Committee of Truth and Reconciliation, and just a picture of Michael Crick on there. I think that'll be a top seller tomorrow. Yeah, lovely. Well, that'll be brilliant. I've got many wishes for 2016, but to see that as a T-shirt is now my number one.
Let's do it.
Yeah, let's do it. Thank you very much for your time today, Aaron. Have a good one. Cheers, mate. Thanks. Lovely.